What would World War III actually look like? That's a question countless people have asked, yet no one truly has an answer. Some imagine nuclear fire, others picture silent cyber wars fought in code, and some believe the first shots have already been fired. But maybe we're asking the wrong question, because predicting how a new world war looks like is nearly impossible. Instead, we should ask, why would the superpowers even fight? What would they want out of a third world war? Because every war is fought for something, and if we can understand what that something is, what each nation's ultimate goal really looks like, we might glimpse the shape of World War III before it even begins. So today we'll dive into the minds of four global giants: Russia, China, the European Union, and, of course, the deeply divided superpower, the United States of America. Before we begin, we need to establish some quick ground rules. Mainly two things. 1. World War III doesn't turn into a nuclear annihilation right away, because that would turn my whole video obsolete. Also, while it's common to immediately associate World War III with nuclear fallout, it's not that likely to happen, at least not in the beginning. In a full-scale nuclear war, everyone loses. And while this might sound very obvious, but the ultimate goal of every major player in any war is to win. The only way any nation would use a nuke is as a very, very last resort. Yes, even Russia. Even North Korea. Also, we are assuming World War III happens soon, sometime in the next 4 years. But why the time limit? The answer is quite simple. By 2029, the US will have a new president. And it's undeniable that America right now is in a stage where every president drastically shifts foreign policy and with it, geopolitical goals. So we can't really answer what America wants during World War III. Instead, we'll answer what Trump's America wants during World War III. And not to spoiler anything, but that is a strange question to answer. Writing the section about America literally broke me. Anyway, enough yapping, let's start. We'll begin with the power whose goals are arguably the easiest to predict, and then move towards more complex players. And the first nation is not only predictable, but already halfway into the war. Russia has easily been the most militarily aggressive power of the 21st century, so it's no surprise that they would play a massive role in any potential Third World War. Now, how Russia would behave in World War III depends heavily on the war's starting conditions. Depending on how strong the West is, they might act boldly or defensively. But regardless of the opening moves, their goals remain the same. At the top of that list, breaking NATO. Russia sees NATO as a direct threat. Key alliance members like Poland, the Baltics, and now Finland sit dangerously close to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And while Russia is stronger than any single NATO country except the US, the alliance as a whole vastly outguns it. Even if America withdraws, the remaining NATO forces still outclass Russia easily. So Russia's #1 strategic goal in World War III would be to dismantle the transatlantic alliance. They would want NATO countries to second-guess the promise of mutual defense, to make them wonder, would anyone actually show up? And in that regard, Russia already scored some victories. With Trump in power, US commitment to NATO is uncertain. Europe is starting to believe that America won't come to their defense. That's already a huge crack in the alliance. But Russia doesn't just want American hesitation. They want NATO to fully crumble from within. That's why they support right-wing parties across Europe, many of which are skeptical of the EU and NATO. The more fragmented Europe becomes politically, the weaker the alliance grows. And once NATO is gone or irrelevant, Russia's second goal becomes possible, reclaiming its sphere of influence. That means dominating or even reintegrating former Soviet republics, nations like Georgia, the Baltics, and of course Ukraine. But that only works in a world where NATO no longer stands in the way. In the early stages of a conflict, Russia would likely test NATO cohesion. They could, for example, move into Baltic cities, close the Suwalki Gap, or land on some Finnish island to see if Western Europe and the US would come and show up to defend NATO's eastern flank. And to some extent, Russia is already testing NATO, for example by violating NATO airspace in the North Sea, Arctic and close to the Baltics, or even through cyber attacks like in Estonia and Germany. In many ways, the Ukrainian invasion itself was a test. Would NATO stand firm or fracture under pressure? For the West, helping Ukraine wasn't just about Ukraine, it was about proving NATO still works. Unfortunately for Russia, while the US might hesitate, Europe seems determined to keep the alliance strong, and arguably NATO has never been stronger, since both Finland and Sweden have also joined in. But still, breaking NATO and regaining their sphere of influence aren't the only major goals Russia has. There is one more significant one that we have to mention to get the full picture. Russia wants to strip America of its global hegemony. Historically, ever since World War II ended, the Soviet Union and the US have been staunch enemies. When Gorbachev introduced perestroika and glasnost, the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR dismantled. The West saw it as the end of the Cold War. America won. But that's not how Russia sees it. To them, the Cold War never ended. From Stalin to Putin, the grandest of Russian goals has always been to defeat America's global dominance. Because once the US ceases to be the world police, they leave behind a power vacuum, which Russia is eager to exploit. Now, if we keep in mind Russia's three major goals, dismantle NATO, regain their sphere, and kick the US off their throne, a lot of their actions make quite a lot of sense. Putin, and by extension Russia, aren't stupid. They are working very methodically towards their distinct geopolitical goals, even if they're often failing. I mean, after all, Ukraine is still standing strong. Now Russia is, as you know, not the only very ambitious global power in the world. Right on their border sits another nation with equally grand goals. But unlike Russia, which acts through brute force and chaos, this nation is very patient. China is without a doubt one of the biggest global players in the world today. No matter what World War III would look like, China will play a major role. Their strategic goals and how they go about achieving them will be a decisive factor in any future global war. So, what does China ultimately want? You might be streaming Taiwan at your screen, and you have a point. Taiwan is a major goal, and we'll get to it in a second, but it's not China's biggest one. Their biggest goal is to prove a point. China as a nation has existed for thousands of years, but the CCP, who's currently ruling China, has only been in power for 76 years. That turns them into a pretty new regime that has a lot to prove. Especially because before the CCP got into power, China experienced the so-called century of humiliation. For around 100 years, China got beaten around time and time again by other nations. And with the Tiananmen Square protests still fresh in their memory, the Chinese Communist Party is paranoid China could get humiliated once again. So they want, no, they need to prove that they are capable of bringing China to glory. And what better way is there to prove that than to replace the United States of America as the world hegemon? And to do that, China really needs just two things, hard and soft power. The US is not only dominating the world by being the strongest military, but also by holding an immense amount of diplomatic and economic power. China wants that too. They want to reshape the global economy and diplomacy around themselves. The soft power they got mostly settled, especially with Trump's crazy tariffs. China is in a great spot diplomatically. But what about their hard power? That's where Taiwan comes in. I think you all know that China wants Taiwan, but why? Well, Taiwan used to be a part of China. The Kuomintang lost the civil war to the communists and fled to the island. Ever since then, the CCP, aka the communists, have sworn to take the island back and unite China once and for all. But while history and nationalism matter, there's an even more urgent reason as to why they want the island so badly: microchips. Taiwan is by far the leading manufacturer of microchips, and it's hard to understate how important these little thinking rocks are in today's day and age. They get used for everything, literally everything. Your microwave, microchips. Your phone, microchips. That super advanced missile system capable of precision strikes on the other side of the globe, you guessed it, microchips. If China managed to take over Taiwan's microchip manufacturing industry, they would gain a truly massive advantage. But Taiwan is not the only expansionistic goal they have. Right below Taiwan is the so-called South China Sea. Given the name alone, it makes sense that China wants to dominate that area. But the South China Sea isn't just water. It's one of the busiest trade routes on Earth. If war ever breaks out, controlling this sea means controlling global trade. Plus, it's rich in oil and gas, resources China wants for itself. But most importantly, it's a buffer zone. If China can dominate the South China Sea, it pushes the US Navy and allied forces further away from its shores. Ideally, they would want that before World War III breaks out, because that would make it a lot easier for them to invade Taiwan. You might now draw similarities between Russia and China. Russia wants to reintegrate a nation into itself, just like China, and both want to dominate their region to create buffers between themselves and their enemies. Russia has taken harsh action to achieve these goals, by among other things invading Ukraine. So why hasn't China invaded Taiwan? Well, remember that soft power we talked about earlier? Russia might not care about economic and diplomatic power, but China does. Right now, the US is taking a step back on the global stage, and China can exploit that. And to do that, they need to be seen as the safer alternative to the US. And to be quite honest, they're on a good path. Europe is expanding trade with China, and both South Korea and Japan were willing to cooperate against US tariffs. That gives China a lot of soft power, and invading Taiwan now would simply destroy all their current leverage. Now, we have covered two nations with very ambitious and aggressive goals. Let's change the tone a little, because the next power is far less ambitious and aggressive, yet their goals might be the hardest to achieve. The good old European Union, famous for peace, prosperity and extremely specific regulations. Like seriously, did you know bottle caps are required to stay attached to the bottle according to EU law? Anyway, what would this behemoth of bureaucracy want in World War III? Well, to put it simply, to survive. But honestly, survival might not be enough, because if the EU wants to protect its values, its borders, and its very reason for existing, it might have to become something it has never been before. You see, the EU isn't a single country, it's 27 different nations trying and sometimes failing to act like one. In peacetime, that's already difficult, but in World War III, that's a recipe for collapse, unless the EU transforms. Europe knows that if World War III breaks out, it can't remain just an economic bloc with a flag and a shared currency. It has to become a superstate in all but name, a centralized power capable of war, diplomacy and self-defense. For decades, Europe relied on the United States, but with Trump back in the White House, that trust has shattered. In Brussels, Paris and Berlin, the message is clear. America can no longer be counted on to defend Western democracy. In fact, it might actively undermine it, and that would be bad enough on its own. But Europe faces threats on every front. To the east, there's Russia. Aggressive, revanchist and already at war with Ukraine. Putin's ambitions are clear. He wants to rebuild his empire. That means swallowing Belarus, dominating the Caucasus and reaching into the EU itself. The Baltic nations are small, exposed and terrifyingly vulnerable. If World War III begins in Eastern Europe, it's these nations that will burn first. And who would come to their aid? Without a unified command structure, without strategic consensus, without the US, Europe might not be able to defend them. A war on home soil against a nuclear-armed adversary with limited coordination, that's not just hard, it's existentially dangerous. But Russia might not even be the EU's greatest threat. The greater danger could be eternal. A union can only be as strong as its weakest link, and some of the EU members are already tilting towards Moscow. Hungary. Populist leaders like Orban praise Putin, sabotage sanctions, and openly question EU unity. Even worse, far-right movements are on the rise across the continent. The AfD in Germany, Le Pen's National Rally in France, Meloni in Italy. These groups oppose the EU, oppose liberal democracy, and increasingly receive support from Trump's America. So here's the nightmare scenario. While Russia attacks from the outside, the EU collapses from within. Pro-Russian populists seize power in key member states, paralyzing any coordinated response. Meanwhile, Washington not only refuses to help, but actively encourages the EU's disintegration. Europe's oldest ally might become its most dangerous adversary. That's the European nightmare, but it doesn't have to be this way. Europe's potential is enormous and hard to understate. The EU has almost as many citizens as both Russia and the US combined. It has the third largest economy, and combined, it spends almost 3 times as much on defense as Russia. And Europe is already pushing against its internal enemies. In Germany, the AfD is now classified as extremist, and Le Pen can no longer hold a public office in France. That turns the EU into a ticking clock for both sides. Every day of delay, every act of division brings it one step closer to collapse, but every moment of unity brings it one step closer to victory. If World War III breaks out when Europe is fully united, the win is in the bag. So World War III for the EU won't just be about tanks or treaties, it will be about unity. Can Europe, this fragile coalition of democracies, reinvent itself as the new defender of liberalism and international order at a time when even the US has walked away? Because if no one else will defend those values, the EU believes it must. World War III would force the EU to become what it has always hesitated to be, a united superpower, one with a military, a doctrine and a mission. Europe knows that. They know the clock is ticking. Either Europe becomes a superpower or a battlefield. In World War III, America will have the strongest army, the biggest budget, the loudest anthem. But none of that matters if the country tears itself apart before the war even begins. The political situation in the United States is more volatile than it's been in decades, especially when it comes to foreign policy. When I started writing this video, Trump was still talking about peace in Ukraine, avoiding harsh rhetoric towards Putin. But that changed fast. Trump has now struck a mineral deal with Ukraine and is threatening Russia with new sanctions. But we all know that could change again quickly. America under Trump is no longer playing by the old rules. The America that stormed Normandy, airlifted Berlin, rebuilt Europe and crushed fascism is gone. This isn't just a leadership change, it's an identity crisis. America is reinventing itself, and the debate over what that new identity should be is tearing the nation apart. The left and right are fighting over the soul of the country, but right now only one side is in power, Trump's side. So what would Trump want in World War III? To some he sounds crazy. He talks about invading Canada and buying Greenland. He slaps tariffs on the world, only to back down a few days later. He deports innocent people to El Salvador and calls it justice. But behind the chaos, there's a motive. And it's simple enough for a child to understand. Trump wants power. That's what he always wanted. And there's a saying, every crisis is an opportunity. That's exactly how Trump would see World War III, a chance to gain power, profit and leverage. Not a war for values, not a war for allies, a war for advantage. Forget America first, Trump first. His goals? Punish enemies, bully allies, enrich himself and his inner circle. If the US drifts into isolation and decline, so be it, as long as Trump is gaining power. But that's only half the story. Because World War III wouldn't just be a foreign policy challenge, it would be a domestic one. In wartime, presidents gain powers, emergency declarations expand, media tightens, protests shrink, institutions bend. The line between democracy and dictatorship begins to blur. So ask yourself, what would Trump do with that kind of power? He wouldn't just use World War III to reshape the world. He'd use it to once and for all win America's identity crisis. But would America really let that happen? Many Americans certainly would. Some anti-Trumpers would probably even rally behind him for stability, but others absolutely wouldn't. Because America isn't just divided, it's fractured, split between two incompatible realities. One side sees Trump as a savior from globalism, corruption and cultural collapse. The other sees him as a conman leading the country into fascism. This isn't just a disagreement anymore, it's a cold civil war. And it wouldn't be the first time America faced internal chaos during a global crisis. In 1968, while the Vietnam War raged, American cities burned with protests and assassinations. After 9/11, brief unity gave way to paranoia through Patriot Act surveillance, endless wars and Guantanamo. And during COVID and BLM, streets turned into battlegrounds between the left and right. But now, imagine all of that again, with nuclear powers on edge, cyber attacks blacking out cities, and social media pouring gasoline on every fire. And that's America's true war. Not just the war abroad, but the war at home. Whether led by Trump, the Democrats or someone else, the goal is always the same. Win the war, both the one abroad and the identity crisis at home. Because in World War III, the battlefield won't just stretch from Ukraine to Taiwan. It would run straight through Washington DC, through the courts, the media and the minds of 330 million people. For the first time in modern history, America's greatest threat in a world war might not be foreign at all. I get it. Maybe this section on the United States wasn't what you expected. Maybe you thought I'd dive into whether Trump would actually defend Taiwan and Europe, or lay out strategic goals like kicking China out of the South China Sea. And sure, there are plenty of videos that do exactly that. But that's not what this video was about. This was about the fundamental goals of the four biggest players in World War III. For Russia, it's about rebuilding its empire, crushing NATO, and kicking the US off its throne. For China, it's about becoming the world's new leader. For Europe, it's about finally uniting and seizing its full potential. But for America, the real goal is to control America. It won't matter to Democrats if Taiwan stands strong, if Trump meanwhile becomes dictator for life, because a nation as divided as the US simply can't chase foreign ambitions without first confronting its internal chaos. And trust me, I know how strange that sounds. I looked for a coherent grand strategy. I tried to make sense of Trump's move with Canada, Greenland and Panama. I tried to frame the US as a unified actor. But the more I looked, the more that idea collapsed, because the truth is, even in wartime, America would never fully unite behind Trump. Not cleanly, not completely. A democracy like the US doesn't just hand over total control, at least not to him. And that's what makes America different. So yeah, those are the major goals behind a potential World War III. Not as flashy as I expected, but maybe that makes them even more important. Let me know in the comments, did I miss any key motivations? What do you think other major players like India, Israel, Japan, Iran or Turkey would want? I hope you enjoyed this video and that it gave you some fresh perspectives on how and why a third world war might be fought. If it did, please consider subscribing. If you want to support me further and get exclusive perks and behind the scenes content, check out my Patreon. Now last but certainly not least, a special thanks to my only paying Patreon so far, Owlhouse and Sulfur Crested Kakadu fan.